Okay, we are going live. Firstly, I want to thank everyone for coming through. Some of you may have joined our Public Safety Solutions Summit last week. We were very lucky to have Stephen Benson, who is with us today, as well as Jay Brown, the founder of Community Shoulders, and Monica McQueen, the founder of Conversations That Matter. So tonight, what we realized then is we had a really robust conversation about public safety, alternatives to police response, mental health, and all of those things. We probably could have continued talking for hours. But we also recognize that we did not get an opportunity to go through all the questions that we received. And so we wanted to make sure we had some time to do that. But to start off, for those who didn't join last time, we'll reintroduce the panel. I'm also excited that joining us is a friend of mine, Will Pack, and he'll share a little bit about his experience. But again, my name is Salah Czapary. I'm a Democratic candidate for Ward 1 to serve on the DC Council. The idea of this summit or this forum is to really answer questions people have around public safety and all of the other spaces that kind of interact with public safety. And then I'm going to hand it over to Stephen and Will to introduce themselves.
Hey, everybody. Excited to be a part of this summit. I'm Stephen Benson. I'm a Ward 8 resident, former Ward 1 resident. I've been in public safety for about 11 years, starting as a call taker, and then as a police or first responder. And it's really important that we have this discussion. We've seen a lot of changes, some good, some bad, as it pertains to public safety over the last 2 years. And I'm really interested in myself to hear more about what Salah has to offer as a candidate here for Ward 1. So I'm going to pass off to Will Pack to introduce himself.
Thanks. Hey, so I'm Will. I have a good amount of time as a volunteer in both the Montgomery County Fire Department since 2009, and I joined MPD as a reserve in 2019. I was actually, to be honest, I was one of Salah's subordinates when he was running the volunteer programs for MPD, but I now involved in sort of higher level things in both the police and fire departments and policy and training and looking at the sort of larger public safety ecosystem. And I'm really, really excited to be able to be a part of this conversation. And I really trust Salah to get us to where we need to be on these things. So I'm happy I can be on the sidelines weighing in when possible. So thanks for having me, Salah.
Thanks. Thank you both for being here. We're going to start this off. I'm going to share my screen and share what was shared last time. This is a screenshot or screen grab that was taken from our last session. We did a Slido word cloud, and we asked everyone, what does public safety mean to you? And these were the responses, and the responses that are bigger are the ones that came through more. So we saw a lot of responses to do with lowering gun violence, to have safe streets. We see that community-led was a very big piece of it, and also more police presence as well. So seemingly a vast kind of spectrum of what people see, but everything kind of connected to wanting to quality of life concerns, wanting to feel safe, and not only wanting to feel safe, but to be safe. So we'll now jump into a few questions. I've asked both Will and Stephen to be here because they bring a lot of practical frontline experience in the public safety system right here in Washington, D.C. Of course, my background's in public safety as well. But we really wanted to give an opportunity for people to hear answers to their questions. So I'm leaning on Stephen and Will to kind of help facilitate this conversation, but we're going to jump right into it. As people, as we're talking through these issues and questions, if people have more questions they want to put in the chat, please feel free to do that. And then, of course, at the end, before we wrap up, if people want to say a few comments, we'll, of course, open up the forum to anyone that wants to participate. And this is being live streamed on Facebook. So for friends or neighbors who weren't able to join, you can send this recording to them later on, and we'll blast it out via email as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephen and Will, and we'll get started.
For sure. I think we should just start with that active poll, that information we got from the last group, because it was a really nice large group. And kind of based on what we saw in that screenshot that you shared, two themes kept coming up. One big theme was the need for more police presence. And the other theme was community-led response. Now, I'm going to flip that to you, Salah. When we say more police presence, that doesn't necessarily mean we need more police, it means more police presence. So I want you to kind of unpack that. But then I also want you to unpack as well the community-led response, both of these from your approach as a candidate, and are the two mutually exclusive?
Yeah, definitely. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I think you make a good point that, more police presence doesn't necessarily mean more police, but it is being strategic with our police resources. And so as I talk with people around Ward 1, what I hear is people want to see police out on bikes. They want to see them out on foot. They want to be able to access them easier. And of course, in a ward of our size, it's an impossible task for every officer to get to know everybody, but people do want to have that opportunity. And so I think when it comes to being community led, is people want to have a hand in where the police are, what their focus is on, and have a hand in that. And so, I think that comes down to really practical things. If there's there was just a shooting the other day out in Parkview by the rec center there. One complaint that I hear often is people want a presence there between MPD and the Rangers. They want people cycling through, checking on that environment or that center. And that's something that we really should be collecting as a community. These are the areas that we want special attention. What type of special attention? That might be, we want some bike cops rolling through, or we want some station over there. Same thing when, we look down at U Street or Florida Avenue, there's some businesses there that, they want officers on foot coming and checking in on the businesses, making sure that there's, no thefts or robberies happening. And, so when it comes to being community led, what I think is really gathering the community together, compiling what we want, what we don't want, and working strategically with the commander of the district, the police district that serves the ward, to make sure we can see those things happen. I mean, I mentioned where we want the police, but I'm sure there's also places where we don't want the police. I think I mentioned this last time, where people ask, well, we don't want the police blocking the bike lane or the bus lane. And so we need an advocate that's going to go to the commander and the officials at the police district and say, like, this is what I'm hearing from the community. How can we make this work? And if we don't have the resources, how do we get the resources? If we do, how do we reposition them so that we can fit them into the needs of the community?
Excellent. Pat, feel free to jump in if you have a follow-up, but I kind of have a follow-up.
For it.
So just get into one of the questions that we have here. What differentiates your approach to public safety from your opponent's approaches?
That's a great question. So I think my approach is three-pronged. There's the first prong is we have to deal with the crisis at hand. I continually hear from people that they're concerned about rising gun violence. They're concerned about a nearly 20-year high homicide rate, the carjackings that have tripled over the last few years. And so what we have to do is make sure our response mechanisms are appropriately staffed. And right now, our response mechanism is the Metropolitan Police Department. But what I also advocate for are these alternative responses, because we need a comprehensive approach to our public safety system and recognize that now the police department is about 280 police officers and detectives short than it was in September 2020. So that means less staff doing more, the same or more amount of work. And that's not what we want. It's not an ideal situation. There are plenty and I'm sure both of you can attest to this as well, there are plenty of 911 calls that really a police officer is not the best tool to intervene, but is the only tool right now that we have beyond the fire department and EMS. And so now when we have less staffing, it's incumbent on us to create these alternatives, not only because they'll help us connect people to the appropriate services, but because in this time of heightened violence, we need the police laser focused on building strong cases against the most violent offenders that will actually be prosecuted. And that kind of takes us to the second prong, which is looking at how do we actually get cases prosecuted. People continue to notice that gun cases are not getting prosecuted. And part of that is reasonable. The police officer that's making arrests is making that arrest based on probable cause. And the prosecutor is going to be looking at it beyond reasonable doubt. And sometimes that's not going to match up. But when we see about 50% of the gun cases not being prosecuted, we have to say, okay, maybe we need to invest more police resources into long-term investigations so we can build stronger cases that can actually be prosecuted. Because right now, what we see is the average homicide suspect in DC has been arrested 11 prior times. So something is not sticking. On the other side of that, there's also a diversion system that we have where youth who are arrested are diverted for age or other factors from arrest, which the idea is a good one. It's, we don't want young people to be caught up in the system. We don't want them to now suffer the consequences of their actions as a young person for the rest of their life. But we can't just divert someone away from arrest into the environment that created that behavior. We have to infuse them with the entire gambit of social services that we have through programming to ensure that we get them back on a path to, gaining that quality education that's going to lead to gainful employment. And so right now, what we see, but with this prosecution diversion, both of those are going to take some time to figure out. One, if you're going to have to staff up detectives units, that means we're changing personnel around. We have to train and build those out. When it comes to diversion, we may have to change the criminal code. And those two things are going to take a lot of time. In the meantime, we have this great set of data that indicates to us that after a certain number of arrests, someone is likely to become the next defendant in a homicide trial, right? And a recent study came out about a month and a half ago that indicated that there are 500 identifiable people in DC who are responsible for 70% of the gun violence. So we know who the likely people are to commit these acts. And so while we focus on building strong cases that can be prosecuted, while we try to figure out how we divert people effectively, we also need to be using that 30% of our city's budget, which is focused on human support services, to try to come up with social interventions in people's lives to get them on a pathway to productive life. And I tell people very clearly, like, not everyone who is already engaged in a violent act is going to be programmed out of that through social programming. But in the meantime, while we try to staff up the building stronger cases and the diversion piece, we have to be doing everything we can to try to make sure that that person does not become the next person picking up an illegal firearm and making all of us unsafe by shooting indiscriminately in the street. And the last piece, and I've been talking for a while, but the last piece is the third prong, which is if we really want to see violent crime reduced in significant numbers over a long period of time, we have to make sure that everyone in our city, regardless of where you grew up, regardless of your family, your neighborhood situation, that you have access to a good quality education, and that good quality education can translate to gainful employment.
I like that. Definitely, we got some question in the chat. I definitely want to hold that, but we're going to get to it. But just unpacking what you said. Okay, for folks who are, I guess, give us an example, like similar to what the shooting has occurred in that area. Definitely I pray for the victims and the loved ones involved, but what alternative resources are going to prevent that, in your opinion? And I guess, how does everything you say, how does that specifically prevent an issue like that, a shooting that occurs? Give it like an example of like, what are some things that need to be done prior? What are some things that need to be done during and after?
To piggyback on that, we know that the district has resources. We have a big budget. We've got got people working in all kinds of these things. Is it a deployment of resources problem? Do we need a bigger budget? Do we need, like, how should we specifically allocate our resources and deploy our resources to these types of scenes to make the biggest difference, you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So, obviously on a shooting scene, the deployment of resources, one is to ensure that we save as many lives as possible, the victims that have been wounded. And also the police department's job is then to investigate and apprehend these suspects. Now, when I talk about all these alternatives, it's not necessarily because these alternatives are going to prevent a shooting, right? But what we're talking about is how do we divert nonviolent, nonviolent crisis calls in the 911 system that police are going to now, like noise complaints or customer disputes or things that it is a crisis. Someone's calling for 911 because they need assistance, but it's not really escalating to violence. If we can divert a percentage of those calls away from the police, that opens us up to the resources that we already have that can now be redirected towards focused patrol on areas where we see a string of shootings or a string of robberies. And so that opens us up to resources there. It also opens us up to move resources into investigations so that we can build those stronger cases. So to your point, it's not necessarily about increasing a budget in the police department or decreasing it. It's about how do we divert certain types of calls for service that are, maybe nuisance type of calls or mental health calls or any type of call that really the police don't have the tools to be able to solve anyway, so that the police can be focused on what they're trained and supposed to do, which is combat violent crime.
Yeah, when it comes to human services, you said 30% of DC's budget goes to health and human services. That's a large amount of money. 30% of 19 billion? Or do you think that's being used correctly at this time? Or how would you, if in position to, allocate those resources in a way that we have services that are assisting folks? Because I mean, what we're seeing a lot is, hurt people are hurting people. And I mean, let's be honest, DC is definitely a tale of two cities when it comes to socioeconomic income, and it's across racial lines. And when we look at our homicides, they're affecting Black and Brown communities more than any community in DC. When you look at the income in DC between Black and Brown communities and white communities, other communities, white communities make 88 times more than Black and Brown communities. So, kind of talk to me a little bit about, how we create an environment for all of our communities to thrive economically.
So I think there's several pieces there, right? There's how do we ensure that our public safety system, our 911 system, is best positioned to meet people in crisis, whatever that crisis is. And the other piece of it is how do we ensure that our whole system in general, our programming, which is intended to try to reduce inequality, whether that be income inequality or education inequality, how is it well positioned to actually meet people where they are? And I think one piece of that question is access. Are we removing barriers? I mean, with a $19.5 billion budget, we have a lot of great programs in the city. And I think of one like some of the first-time home buyer programs, right? Before COVID, to get into one of those programs, you needed to sign up online for that program. That's already a barrier. If you don't have internet access, you don't have a computer, you don't have an easy way to get on the internet, that's a barrier for you. And so then once you manage to sign up, you then have to go to in-person seminar. And that may be across town, and you may be working 1 or 2 jobs and you're not able to take off work, or if you do, that's lost wages for you. You may not have access to public transit, and now you need to take an Uber, and that's expensive. So already we've created some barriers. So I think fundamentally, rather than necessarily reprogramming money and funds to programs, we have to really look, are we removing barriers for access? And I tell this to people all the time, like, you just have to look on a DC government website to see that unless you know what you're looking for, it's really hard to find. And even if you know what you're looking for, it's still really hard to find. So I think fundamentally we have to look at the systems. Are we removing barriers? Are we making access easier? Then in the public safety system, right now, when you look at the 600,000+ calls for service that the police department goes to every year, about 80% of them do not result in an arrest, in an offense report, or an incident report. And what that indicates to me is that about 80% of the calls really don't have any police action that is needed. And therefore, there are opportunities there for us to make sure that we are intervening in the 911 system, having those touch points with people that have called on 911 to get them into the human support services piece of the budget. Because the police budget is only 2.8% of the city's budget, but human support services is 30% or 33%. But the problem with that is that a lot of those agencies are not operating on a 24/7 basis. So, one thing that I'm sure both of you have come across, and I remember coming across a lot, is interacting with someone who was unhoused. Either they were robbed or they lost their ID. And suddenly, if you don't have an ID, that is a big barrier to getting any type of service or get into any type of programming in the city. So as a police officer, the most you could really do in the moment is take a report, ask them if they have a case manager, try to help them get that case manager on the phone. But imagine how much more we could do if we had people in the 911 system 24/7, who, if a police officer comes across someone in need, can call upon them and get them that support right then and now. So I think we're very lucky in the city that we have such an extensive budget. And we just have to think a little more creatively of how do we remove barriers and how do we innovate.
I think that's a good response to that. I think that's clearly the path we need to be thinking about as we go about looking at this in a holistic way, not just trying to nitpick one or two things that can change, that can be a silver bullet to change, to flip the script on public safety citywide overnight. That's obviously the case. I'm going to segue this into the question that we got from John here about whether or not you're satisfied between the cooperation between NPD and Metro police forces. I'm assuming also, there's 37 police forces or police agencies in DC alone, and there's only one that handles 911 calls, and there's only one that handles civil disturbances for the most part, and that is both MPD. Is there an improvement you can think of for that? Or obviously there's some jurisdictional issues, right? We can't have, we can't have people leaving their jurisdiction to come, go beyond what they're able to do on MPD's turf, if you will. But is there anything we can do to kind of take the load off MPD without hiring? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think it's a great question. And, I think it gets to the issue of just coordination, cooperation amongst any type of agency, right? Like right now at the high level, agency heads, even, the executive staff or command staff, they're working with each other, they're coordinating, especially when there's protests or other types of big events. And there is coordination, but on the day-to-day basis, an officer in MPD and an officer in Metro aren't really interacting with each other unless they're on a scene where they both happen to be because of a 911 call. And I think the more we can create spaces where officers and other agency personnel are working together, the better we're going to be able to serve residents of the city. I think of this just with folks that are in the fire department and MPD, or in the community response team and MPD. If you know someone who works in another agency and know what they're able to do and what they're able to not to do, you just have a higher likelihood as an officer to call them up and say, hey, I've come across this person. How can we help them? Is there something we can do? And I think if we can be intentional about creating those environments with the people who are doing the work, not necessarily just the people who are leading the work, we can increase outcomes. So yes, I think there needs to be more coordination. The reality is right now officers in both agencies aren't really interacting with each other unless they're on a scene of a crime.
And I want to follow up with you on that. Could you also explain to folks and listeners, basically, what is the interaction between MPD and Metro? Because there is some limitations, and there's a huge limitation of Metro's abilities versus ours. So naturally, based on those two functions, there would be a limited interaction, right? But then in that vein, explaining that, maybe kind of demystify. I know a lot of times we hear what is said about, we have the most police in the area, we're the most, or do you think we have the most police presence in the area per capita because we have all these agencies? I guess debunk that whole idea of all these agencies working in the city. Is it just MPD, or is this huge collaboration that folks might think is taking place?
Great question. I think, DC is unique. We have 30 plus law enforcement agencies, but as Will said, the only one that's answering 911 calls is MPD. And now there are times where 911 call occurs on the jurisdiction of another agency like Metro, where it's, in a Metro stop or, on the bus lines. And then that police agency is handling that. But, most of the time, a 911 call is happening in the municipal jurisdiction, and therefore it's falling on MPD. And because we're the nation's capital, the police department here functions not only as a state police department, but also a county sheriff and the local police department. And so just by that nature alone, it's going to have a larger piece of staffing. On any given day, there's 50 First Amendment assemblies, protests, and that could be the one person with a sign down at the White House, or hundreds of thousands of people coming into the city. So there's a whole department within our local police department that deals with that, and that's a huge staffing piece. And then also, the Metropolitan Police Department leads the presidential motorcade. So there's even a whole piece of the department that is devoted to those type of things. So when we get down to the people who are actually patrolling the streets, it's only about or previously was only about 1,200 officers. And so then when the department saw a reduction in force by about 280, that's a huge chunk out of the patrol services. And patrol services is where you're going to see the officers on bikes, the officers out on foot patrol, officers in cars in the neighborhood. So, I actually forget what your original question was, but I hope that answered it.
And jumping on this too, I think this is a very common kind of misconception about the way policing in DC works, just in general, because you don't necessarily want all these different federal agencies that are included in that 37 number jumping in and handling all kinds of regular police interactions. Just because there's different policies, they have to abide by different rules. Some like federal, a federal police officer, like if a park police officer sees someone with marijuana in DuPont Circle, like they have to make an arrest, whereas it's decriminalized in DC. So there's different rules and standards for MPD, and we don't necessarily want to confuse that too much. And also, I was on a scene the other day where the Office of Government Publishing Police had done a traffic stop, and I'm glad they're proactive and everything, but they're not on our radio channel. So if something bad happens, we won't know about it very quickly. It's just, it can create a sort of tangled mess. And it's best if we have clearly defined guidelines for each agency, and everybody assists when they can. The big things that are happening are intel. And, obviously it's a lot, we were talking about how ATF and other agencies are assisting with MPD's intelligence, especially for getting these illegal guns off the street. And that's like more of a, in our opinion, at least, right, a valid use of those resources, as opposed to actually handling 911 calls or getting involved in that way more directly, right?
No, certainly. And, as people want, more officers that are, familiar with the neighborhoods, that are, assigned to the neighborhood more consistently, we're going to want our municipal police to function in that role. We don't necessarily want any outside agency coming to enforce, any laws in our local jurisdiction. very useful for kind of strategic pieces. And as you said, in working with the ATF to come up with strategies to make sure we're tracking these ghost guns and the movement of firearms into the district. But when it comes to the community interactions and dealing with local issues, we want local police officers doing all of that.
Certainly. So although I know you like talking about this stuff and you're very knowledgeable about it, we're going to pivot a little bit, if that's okay with you, Salah, just to include a broader scope of what's going on in terms of public safety in the city beyond just policing specifically, right? So we have been having a lot of conversations with the community about this. And by the way, anyone who's on the call, feel free to type a question in the chat, and we'll try to get to it. This is a value of having a smaller group discussion with the candidate for the ward here. But something we've been talking about is how, and I'd like to get your take in front of everybody here about how you see DC's public schools and social service systems playing into crime reduction and public safety in the city. So beyond just policing, are there other sort of upstream solutions to handling crime before we end up having police reacting to crime that's already happened?
Yeah, actually today, as I was door knocking, I got the opportunity to talk to a DC public school teacher, and she had mentioned to me that it's just so obvious, like when a student falls behind, stops coming to school, like gets in trouble, like she's like, it's almost as if you can just guess that this person is going to be one of those now young kids that are carjacking or robbing someone. And her assessment was we don't have the effective interventions to assist students. We know what we should be doing, we just haven't done it yet. And so I think, yes, 100%, I think there are upstream failures that lead someone to eventually pick up an illegal firearm and rob someone or carjack someone. That doesn't mean we don't enforce the law. We have to. When people put all of us at risk, we have to be clear that the law is law, and we have to make an arrest. And whether we divert someone to programming that's effective, or whether we prosecute them, that is handled on a case-by-case basis. But we have to make sure that whether we're doing one or the other, it's effective. Before we get to that point, talking about the average homicide suspect having 11 prior arrests, I mean, it is clear that there are patterns of behavior that eventually lead to violent acts. And we need to be more intentional about picking up on those even before an initial arrest occurs. And so we have to ensure, like I said before, that everyone in the city has an opportunity to get a quality education that leads to gainful employment. And part of that is not just ensuring that our schools have the appropriate staffing and funding. We spend a lot of money on our schools. So again, it's not always about just throwing more money. It's about how do we ensure that our teachers have the best training, that we create space for them to get the training that they need so that they can effectively serve their students. In break periods, whether it's spring break or summer break, how do we ensure we have programming that's available to everyone? And that may mean the expansion of funding in certain areas. And then also ensuring that we have not everyone is their path is not going to always be to go to college. There are people who want to do trades or other professions, and we have to cater to those as well. And I kind of want to bounce the question off of Stephen a bit, because he has experience. He has a daughter that's in the school system, and what are some of the things that you think of as a parent when it comes to education in DC, and also understanding that you have all this experience in public safety?
Definitely, you hit on some points that I definitely agree with. Just going to my public safety experience as a responder to missing person calls of juveniles. I've been in situations where it starts off with just coming home late, right? Skipping school. You find the juvenile. You figure out. You get to know them. You talk to them, and it could be a small issue. It could be a situation where there's one particular kid that I was helping out. He didn't have Wi-Fi at the house. He lived with his grandmother. His grandmother was 80-something years old. His mother died of terminal illness, and his father wasn't in his life. So you have an 80-year-old, woman raising a 13-year-old, that's a huge age gap. I mean, there's a lot of issues there. He can run the circles around it, right? Skipping out on school, going to the McDonald's, use the Wi-Fi. I go pick him up, bring him back, give him an Oscar-winning speech about, trying to divert him away from things. Over time, I've seen he kind of got mixed up in some crowds, started stealing chips from the corner store. That escalated to being barred. Then and he got a little bigger. Him and his crews wanted some money, that they started doing robbery in small little tandems, in their little, and then that escalated to, I guess eventually, unfortunately, he kind of got into the whole drug game, and seeing how that money was really appealing. And now today, I mean, I just seen so much life that was gone, and it's so tough as a first responder, seeing this person as a kid, talking to him, trying to get resources around them, and just, let's be honest, it's always not a happy story at the end of that. So I say that because I have a question, and I'll come back to that. But as a parent, you're right. I have a 10-year-old. She goes to schools in DC. It feels so. She's lucky enough to go to a small school where the teachers have the bandwidth and the ability and the capabilities to really focus in on things. Obviously, if Ruth does, if my daughter's name is Ruth, by the way, if she goes to school, has an issue with a student, they're able to unpack that a little bit more. I think staffing is really important there, for the ratio of staff to kids. I've seen that has been really helpful in allowing the teacher the time to really unpack in issues that students are experiencing in the social interactions with each other. But it is very key. It's really the home as well. I'll be honest with you. We can have all the resources in the world, but the home is clutch, and we have to invest in our families, because I mean, we're thankful enough that Ruth lives in a household where both her parents have advanced education. We're doing the research to try to be better parents, and we have access to a lot as well. So we're definitely, I would say, we're privileged in that aspect. But to flip around to the story that I was saying, I know as first responder, I notice and I see kids going to school and going late, and they're looking at the guys that are hanging out, right? And they're like, "Hey, that looks cool." I've spoke to agencies about, hey, look, how can we also focus our attentions on helping these guys and girls that are hanging out, all night long, getting into things. How do we divert these skills that they have into legal ways, right? So that we don't have someone that these kids are looking over their shoulder to beat, and we can, and because they're the influencers when you think about it in the neighborhood, right? So, but from what I've experienced, there's not a lot of agencies focus on the school age kids, but they don't focus on the kids that are kind of men almost, not that are out here who are not in school, right? So, what are some resources, and you might not have to answer that now, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how do we engage these 500 identifiable people, right, who may have not committed the homicide yet, but have a rap sheet, right? How do we engage them in a way that they can find meaningful employment? Because I'm gonna be honest with you, the way some of these business structures are created, if you smoke marijuana, you're not getting a job at Target, probably. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but there's a lot of places where if you're doing certain things, you can't get a job, right? And if you don't have a high school diploma, it's hard to get a job. So now we have a community of young boys, young women, young men who, maybe involve themselves in these substances that we now deem legal in DC, and they're disenfranchised from certain levels of employment, right? And then due to the fact that they don't have that formal education, they're disenfranchised from certain levels of employment. But they have these skill sets, right? So how do we connect with them and really get them an opportunity? Because when you're making that type of money that they could be making on the street, that's not $13 an hour at Target money, right? So I don't know. Do you have anything on that?
I mean, I think, again, so much of this comes down to we have great organizations, great programs that are engaging people and trying to get them trained up and into meaningful employment. And the question becomes, how do we expand the access? So many people, I had the benefit that, when I was old enough, someone walked me through how to start a bank account, right? And how to open a bank account. I am sure that there are plenty of people that don't have someone to walk them through that process. They don't have someone who has able to walk them through the process of getting a driver's license or completing their GED or accessing those programs. So part of it is, again, access, and how do we make sure there's equitable access across the city so people can be connected with folks. And part of it is this proactive outreach. I mean, there are places where we know people hang out, and if we don't have people that are out there reaching out and engaging them in opportunities, they may not be seeking them out, or they may not know where to seek them out. So I think part of it is being proactive in our approach, and also recognizing that there are already great programs that we can expand, whether they're private programs or programs through DC government. And what I hear from a lot of local businesses as well is that they would be more than happy to hire people, but what they also want is some type of training program that maybe the DC government sponsors, or a program that's funded by DC government sponsors, so that they know that that we can remove barriers for them, so they know that when they're hiring somebody, that they've gone through some type of professional development and they're ready to go. And that professional development probably includes, let's open your first bank account, let's get your license, let's help you get a Metro card or whatnot. Let's get you into these programs that are going to remove barriers for you. So, we have to be we have to have a holistic approach. We also have to recognize that part of this is meeting people where they're at. And that practically sometimes means meeting them on the corner of the block they're hanging out at.
We should pivot really quick back to schools. We have a question in the chat about it from earlier. Lee's asking how you coordinate and integrate DCPS charter and community/service orgs in an equitable way, and not leaving it to who has the contacts or which schools have the bandwidth to handle the workload, I'm assuming.
It's a great question. Too often, and it may seem that I'm repeating myself, but too often, because our systems are so hard to navigate, it becomes who do you know and who can help you get through the system, right? So there's definitely an element of how we have to streamline processes. I think when it comes to DCPS, charter, and community service organs, whether they're PTAs or other organizations that are supporting schools, what we do have to recognize is that the schools that have the bandwidth to have a PTA that is raising significant amount of money to help with programs, that's great. It shows a lively community that is banding together to support students. But we also have to recognize that distribution of wealth and resources is not equal across the city. And so what we need to do is be intentional about making sure we can expand resources to schools that don't have that type of support network, and then build that support network. And how we practically do that, I think we have to, I don't think we have, and I don't know if we have the answer yet. But it certainly comes down to ensuring that we can share resources, because at the end of the day, the problems, and Jay, who was with us last week, says this all the time. The problems that we ignore in other communities will one day be at our doorstep. If we do not make intentional investments in schools that may be several miles away, if we are saying now, which I think we're all agreeing, that the lack of a quality education that leads to gainful employment is eventually, in certain circumstances, leading to violent crime, well, then we're seeing that effect now. And that's why, even though it may seem unrelated to move or redistribute some resources to other schools, that is actually a benefit to all of us, because we're making sure that we're raising all of us up together.
And there's a follow-up.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. and I think that just to jump in, that yeah, I think that since you're basing your platform, it sounds like on public safety and equity citywide, that's standardization process and making sure that it's not a bunch of handshake deals and arbitrary principle skill or experience or whatever is important. I think that's the right place to start for sure. This is related to that question, but also from Lee about how you see your leadership in Ward 1 connected to the broader DC community and across the city, even the resource richness you'd be leading as opposed to other areas in the city. So once you win this campaign and you're on the DC council, you're going to be in a little bit of a interesting position because Ward 1 is not representative of each of it. It's not a match to the other wards exactly, and you'll be thinking through decision making for the city at large as well. And how's that going to work?
Yeah, I think Lee just put a comment in the chat, which I think kind of touches on it. What's written is well-funded parent orgs should be encouraged and pushed to adopting, mentoring, and supporting sister schools and resource deserts and share the wealth. And I'm 100% on board with that. I can see where certain organizations or parent groups may have resistance to that, but I think part of it is just the messaging of there's a productivity in investing in resource deprived areas. I mean, we acknowledge it constantly that inequity leads to the issues that we have to deal with right now, which is rising violence, the income disparity, and also just educational outcome disparity as well. So I think we should certainly be proud of the neighborhoods we're building here, the schools we're building here, but we also have to recognize that we're part of one ecosystem. Just because we have a political division of a ward doesn't mean that the issues in Ward 7, 8, or 5 don't affect us as well. And so if we can have that holistic approach as a city, I think we can more equitably distribute resources. And I think there's another comment in here, but I'm sure we'll get to it eventually.
Yeah, we could just read that comment. I think James is getting ready to go to another meeting, but he said there's a need to think about and act on long-term, midterm, and near-term solutions to public safety. One of my issues with Brianne is that she doesn't seem to acknowledge anything but the long term. But I need to be able to walk the Target or the grocery store safely today. What, I guess, in balancing that as a candidate, near term, long term, what do you say to your constituents on how, I guess, in the first 100 days, you're going to, where is your focus going to be?
100%. I mean, I think I touched on it earlier that we have to be intentional and have a long-term goal, which is so connected to ensuring that we have quality education that's leading to job opportunities. We have to invest in that intentionally, but also recognize that that is a longer-term goal, because those investments today, we may not reap the fruit of them for 5, 10, 15 years. And so in the near term, when we're talking about our response agencies, we talk about MPD, the fire department, and then whatever these alternatives are, people not only want to feel safe, they need to be safe. And when we've seen this increase in violent crime and homicides, it's totally understandable that people do not feel safe. And, my goal would be to convene much like what we're doing now, but on a larger scale, a community kind of think tank of what are the areas of need. Is it, do we want, we know we're deploying resources in Columbia Heights because of the uptick in shootings, but maybe that's not having an effect. And maybe officers in their cars doesn't make people feel safer or be safer. And maybe we need to experiment with having bike officers out there. Maybe we need to experiment with having these alternative responses, proactively working with the police to identify areas that may be issues. Violent crime is not random. There are trends we can follow, and we have to be able, not only as a community and the police department and as nonprofit groups, be able to respond to those proactively. So I would definitely be engaging the community in regular public safety forums like this to ensure we can capture where people see needs. Because even though the police department's focus is on public safety, at the end of the day, people who live in neighborhoods know where the problems are. They know where there are needs for intervention, and we can capture that information and relay it to the appropriate authorities.
I want to echo a Salah statement from an earlier version of these conversations. I think that you made a good point then. I want to echo it now in case anyone missed it, that that in reality, the long term is kind of the easiest, especially for a politician, to talk about, right? There's with long term things, you got time to blue sky situation, figure out the budget or funding later, to do a trial period and see what works, then tinker with it. The midterm is kind of a vague thing because it means different things to different people, but realistically speaking, the midterm should be all you need to do is sort of like be on the right track, right? But the near term is the most difficult and the most expensive, because if you're going to be doing some sort of long-term project like a violence interrupter program as a transition away from more traditional public safety approaches like a armed uniformed police force, you're going to have to double down and do that simultaneously to continuing to fund the same number of officers while we trial something. In any other business, you wouldn't skip a beta test period and just scrap what you have and switch to a new software and then roll the dice on whether or not it works, right? And so that initial investment of time and energy it's expensive, it's important, and I think that if you're a politician, it takes some courage and wherewithal to say, I'm going to try something that's going to potentially not work, and I'm going to do it concurrently with paying for something that people have brought up legitimate concerns with, because until we have something better, we can't just leave people out in the cold, or in this case, like being concerned about a trip to the grocery store. So I think that that transition period is something that you've talked about a lot, and how to transition from one form of public safety to something else over a period of time with community input is something that's going to be quite a process, right? But specifically for the near term, do you think that there's a possibility that in the next year we're going to be able to get the city significantly safer without and if so, what changes do you think we'll have to make to get there?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say about your comment on beta testing, I think that of course, like we don't just scrap a system without creating a new one, but I also think that we're lucky that we have good use cases not only in other cities that have been experimenting with alternative responses, but also here in DC. One of the programs that I led at MPD was our domestic violence liaison program, and what we did there was we trained civilian volunteers with DC Safe, and they rode with police officers in the 5th, 6th, and 7th districts. And on scenes of domestic violence, when the scene was rendered safe, they would refer victims to services. And the reason the department did, sponsored that program was there was a recognition that you can be the nicest officer ever, but sometimes that uniform is a barrier, and that it's helpful to have people who are specifically trained to, refer victims to services that are offered. And we have many of them. So, if we can do it with volunteers, we can do it with paid staff. It's just a matter of expanding services in the 911 network. We did it. We do it already. I mean, we have the fire department and EMS, and and the police. There's no reason we can't do it with other types of services, whether that's kind of crisis, crisis response or mental health response or any other type of response. And, one thing that I can see, an immediate need is more people overdosed and died in our city than were killed in a homicide last year, by nearly double. And that's a great example of where the intervention of a police officer and even the fire department can only go so far. Officers carry Narcan, they revive people, but after they've revived the person, there's really not much they can do. There's no specialty program that they can refer someone to. But if there were other people on patrol from the Department of Behavioral Health or addiction counselors, maybe we could increase the likelihood that someone would willingly go into some program. We're seeing that out in New York with their mental health team, that the likelihood of someone willingly going to the hospital to seek care increases when the ask is made by a non-uniformed response. And so I think there's opportunities to do that.
I want to point out my former roommate was a still is a domestic violence liaison. It was a great program, one of many volunteer programs within MPD, all of which Salah ran during his time at the department when he sort of worked at the intersection of what the department wanted at the higher ranks and also what the community wanted as a touch point within the department for the community. So it is a good program. I think that is currently 100% staffed by volunteers, and there's what, like 30 of them, less probably now. And I think that we need to take that successful use case and figure out how to double down on it and apply it to, and see if it's even applicable to other things. And honestly, there's only one person in the race right now that's actually run something like this, and it's Salah, so that's heartening. I do think you'll be able to speak to this question from Jane here about how, keeping with the statistic you cited, that the majority of crimes committed by 500 individuals. A series of studies in the 90s by Lawrence Sherman showed something very similar, that most violent crime happens in a surprisingly small number of city blocks, very concentrated and identifiable areas. Since we seem to know who's committing the crimes and where they're committing crimes, have you heard of any cities developing response plans based on this knowledge? Now, we know that cops on dots is a pretty well-known term, and it is something that DC's already been doing. Can you talk about what the current programs are in place in DC within MPD to put police officers in high crime blocks, and the pros and cons of doing things that way, and maybe what else we can do?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think what studies indicate is that even though sometimes the community says, if there's been a shooting somewhere, we want to have a police officer on the block. The studies indicate that actually that's not the most effective deployment of resources, that the most effective deployment is having kind of this hotspot policing, where we know there's a trend of either it's a shooting or a violent crime or break-ins, that an officer is moving around and every hour coming through for 15 minutes or so. So there is a need to strategically move the department to deploying that way. As far as working with these, 500 identifiable people, we saw the city experimented with building blocks where they identified the blocks. I think it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was whatever the number was. Those were the majority
100.
of. Sorry, go ahead.
I think it was 100 blocks.
So yeah, maybe it was 100, and in total, that's where maybe 40% of sounds of gunshots and shootings occurred. So there are definitely strategies that are being implemented, and it's a whole government approach. I know recently the mayor announced, a focused effort on these 200 individuals, and so what the consideration we have to take is like, yes, we have this data that indicates that these are the people who are likely to commit the next violent act. But we also want to have a constitutional police department, and we can't just surveil people because they have a criminal record, right? So there is a need to, of course, when there's an indication that criminal activity is occurring, that we build strong cases. But at the same time, that's why the social services response is important, because yes, we know that the data indicates that this person is likely going to reoffend, but it's not guaranteed. So we can't necessarily deploy police resources to surveil them, of course. But what we can do is create social interventions to try to get someone to be, removed from a path of violence into a path of productive life. And so I think that is the aim of this new program, the initiative that the mayor has announced. And that's where it becomes a question of how do we make sure that our agencies are working together, that we know who the individuals are when we're making those social interventions available. We know where they hang out, and we're making those social interventions available where they are. And then when violence does occur, that our police department is positioned, well positioned to be able to build a strong case that can be successfully prosecuted.
Now, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that. If I don't know if you had something, Will, was, I hear you say, police build a strong case. As you know already, police officers can identify someone, they can find probable cause for an arrest, they can bring them through the, judicial process in a sense. But after you arrest somebody and you charge them, that's how the police job is done, right? So, how much of this is, you think, building strong cases on the police side versus our judicial system as it relates to USAO, our federal court, district, DC code specifically, because it's a very complex issue, and then when it comes to, we thankfully we're not in a world in DC right now where we're, trying to give someone 1 million years for things. They could have committed crimes and been out or been not being held. Like, unpack that a bit.
So there's several pieces, right? So there's one piece, which is, yes, it's incumbent upon the police department to be resourced to build a strong case that they can then present so the prosecutors can decide whether they can prosecute or not. And part of that is just making sure we're analyzing the data. Why are cases not being prosecuted? If it's a Fourth Amendment issue, 50% of the time, then that may indicate that we need additional training, or we have to reposition resources when an arrest occurs so that we can build a stronger case. So there's that piece. The other piece that you touched on is, of course, once the case is brought, if the prosecutors decline, there's nothing beyond that can be done. But we have to have that open dialogue with the USAO to understand why they are declining cases. Since we are not a state and the USAO is federal, we don't have control over our courts, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be following the data and trying to best position our local police department to bring the strongest cases. And then you also touched on, Stephen, the law. I mean, there are laws that have codified diversion. They've codified how we charge people. And if it is not resulting in the outcomes we want, then we have to revise those, of course. Another consideration here is that DC doesn't control its own prison system. When someone is arrested and is sentenced and charged and sentenced for a felony or longer than a year, then they are remanded into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and they could be sent to a prison, in Wyoming or halfway across the country or all the way across the country. And that also then denies them the opportunity to stay linked with their family and causes, when they are eventually released, a higher likelihood of them reoffending. And so I think the part of the discussion here is, how do we work, until DC becomes a state, how do we work with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to ensure that DC prisoners are actually kept closer to home in Virginia or Maryland or maybe Pennsylvania, so that families can maintain that connection? And then we have to have also an intentional discussion of how do we ensure that the parts of the prison system that we do control, the DC jail, which is where people would be held before they're transferred to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and when they are returning for about a year before they are released, how do we ensure that the part that we do control is best positioned to rehabilitate people and to get them back into productive life? I had the opportunity before COVID to go visit the DC jail, what I was, and I think, Stephen, you may have been there as well. We ended up meeting a bunch of folks who had done significant amounts of time in prison for from violent offenses all the way to homicide. and they had formed a group of people that were supporting each other. They're getting ready to be reintroduced into society, and there was a wealth of knowledge there and a wealth of desire to help young people not make the mistakes they made when they were young. And I think that's another resource that we need to tap into is this group of returning citizens, and we need to be able to support them. They did their time, and they are a wealth of opportunity for us to combat violence in the city.
So this is a good moment, I think, because you were discussing sentencing, which is obviously a major issue in the whole debate about repeat offenders, whether or not the prison system is a good it is a valuable form of punishment that is going to actually deter crime, or if it's actually creating criminal problems. And it's a very complex discussion. You got a question in the last one that we haven't addressed yet about sentencing, which someone asked, no one wants to see children put behind bars. Obviously, we're dealing with a huge amount of youth crimes, carjackings, things like that. What do you think is the best plan for addressing youth crime specifically?
Yeah, I mean, obviously people want to have a very compassionate response to young people committing crimes. And so we have to recognize that, when young people do harm, that they do have to be held accountable. But we also have to have a measured response to ensure that our accountability system is also getting them back onto a path of productive life. And I touched on this earlier, that's why we really need to invest in diversion programs. It's not that I disagree with them. I disagree with how they are enacted right now, where we're just diverting people back to the environment that was not able to prevent that behavior. And instead, we need to be putting them in an environment that infuses them with the resources they need to get caught up on their education, so that they can, re-enter community life and not have a high likelihood of reoffending and harming people. And of course, there are cases where juveniles commit very violent acts, homicides, carjackings that lead to someone's death. And I think, at a certain point, diversion is no longer the appropriate response to a violent act. And that's when, we have to go through the prosecution route. But I say that to say that we have to be intentional about diversion, because, right now, for example, we'll have, a young person commit a carjacking when they perhaps were wearing a hood, so the victim is not able to identify them. So then when they are eventually arrested, they're charged for, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, and that is a much lesser charge. And so that's not necessarily triggering them to be put into a diversion program. So we also have to be intentional about how we are diverting people, so that we recognize the realities of the system, that yet they may get triggered to go to some type of programming, when a charge is here, but maybe we need to do it here so we can catch them earlier, so that we give them the opportunity to not be on this pathway to more and more violent acts.
I think it's a fair response. Well, we have a ton of older questions from the last talk. I don't know how much longer you guys want to go on this. We seem to be losing some participants here. I guess it's really up to the candidate here. He's hosting
Well, I say
us.
let's try to go through a few more questions, and we're recording this, so I'll send it out to folks. I want people to definitely have the opportunity, if they ask the question, to get a response. And a lot of the questions overlap, I'm sure. So maybe we can do a few on traffic, since that's a thing that I hear a lot about.
Gotcha.
Well,
there's one about.
yeah.
No, go ahead. Will. You go ahead.
No, I asked last one. It's your turn.
Okay. There's one about the no chase rule.
Good. That's what I was going to ask too.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm reading your mind. The no chase rule, and you're gonna have to maybe explain that to people. Encourages law break. This is a question. or a statement, I guess. The no chase rule encourages law breaking because there's no consequences from running away from cops. Are you supportive of it? Question mark, question mark.
So, so basically the no chase policy is that, officers are not going to chase a vehicle for a non-violent offense. That policy is rooted in the data that indicates that police chases are extremely dangerous to the public, and there's a high likelihood of serious injury or death to the public in a high-speed chase. So I think that, yes, we should not be chasing cars for traffic offenses, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it, right? Specifically when it comes to ATVs, for example, I hear a lot of people who say, well, why can't we chase these ATVs? And at the end of the day, I don't think we should be chasing them. It creates too much of a hazard, and the last thing we want to do is create an environment where the public or even the riders are being harmed because of a police chase. But those vehicles are not street legal. They're not rendered safe to be on the street. I hear from a lot of folks that they blow through red lights and they weave through traffic, and it creates unsafe conditions. And so when those vehicles are parked or filling up for gas, the DPW, MPD, we need to empower the agencies that are responsible for enforcing traffic laws to seize those vehicles. We don't have to arrest anyone. We just need to seize them so that we can create safe conditions on the road. And I think long term, there are ideas that have been put forward. I think I was reading about one in Colombia where they had issues with dirt bikes, and they created dirt bike parks, but that was a long-term investment over 15 years to create safe usership in an area where people could use the equipment. And anyone who's ever rented an ATV, I'm sure agrees they're fun to use on the beach or in the desert. And so yes, we could create a space or an arena where we could have ATVs, and I'm definitely not opposed to that. But again, like the immediate need is they're creating unsafe conditions on the road. They're hopping up onto curves, they're blowing through red lights. And so we need to enforce our traffic laws and seize them. And beyond ATVs, I know that someone had asked last time, we didn't get to touch on it, was regular drivers from out of state who are speeding and blowing through stop signs and red lights and creating unsafe conditions. The reality right now is in DC, there's about 600,000 vehicles that are eligible to be booted. And what that means is they have two delinquent unpaid tickets from either automatic red light camera or speed camera. And most of those vehicles are out of state because we have no reciprocity agreement with Maryland or Virginia. And there may not be an appetite to create a reciprocity agreement with Maryland and Virginia. And so what we need to do, because right now we only have 4 individuals in the entire city that can boot cars, what we need to do is put some Washingtonians to work and boot those cars. And there's an equity issue too. Maybe the where we're enforcing the speed right now, or how the red light cameras are programmed, maybe that's not the nexus of reckless behavior. But I think we can all agree, when you have 9, 10, 11, 12 tickets that add up to thousands of dollars and they're unpaid, at that point you're being reckless, and driving is a privilege, and you have to obey the rules of the road. And if you're not going to, then you will find a boot on your car, and until you pay that boot, those tickets, that boot will remain. So I think there's this measured approach. We have to make sure we're following the data, that we're not doing harm to low-income drivers that are going to create barriers for them getting a license and maintaining their license. And I think cities have done really good innovative things, like making tickets based on your income, so that the penalty is measured. But at the same time, like, not enforcing the penalty is also not the solution.
I wanted to follow up with that. You kind of touched on the end. What do you say to folks who think these tickets are too expensive? I mean, you go 11 miles over 25, that's $100 ticket. That doubles in 30 days. That's 200. I mean, that's a lot for me. I don't know who can just brush off a $100, $200 ticket just from a camera, right? But and then also unpacking, I think also into that whole DC, Maryland, Virginia thing, and this is kind of like maybe an education point to people, is that just because folks have Maryland and Virginia license plates doesn't mean they're Maryland, Virginia residents. I mean, we have a lot of people in our DC community who have Maryland and specifically Virginia tags, because Virginia allows you to register. You could be probably in Norway and register in Virginia. I don't know. I mean, obviously not that far, but Virginia lets you register. They love that tax money, right? So, you know, where I live in Ward 8, I mean, you just walk down the street, you'll see nothing but Maryland and Virginia license plates. So I say that to say that we may be blaming out of town people for in-town people with Maryland and Virginia license plates. But do you think the penalty, how do you balance the effectiveness of the penalty, right? The financial penalty without hurting, large segments of the population who are already struggling economically, or are there ways that you can innovate the traffic camera system to make it work and deter?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit as, we can look at what other cities and jurisdictions are doing where they're basing penalties based on income. And if people are unable to pay penalties, then it's based on community service or other things. I think we need to be innovative, and the default often is, okay, well, we'll just not enforce the law. And I don't think that's the answer, but also the other answer is not, this is the law and that's the only way we can do it. I think we have to have a measured approach. We have to follow the data. And, part of what you're indicating is that, people who may not be able to afford the penalties in DC are maybe registering cars in Virginia, or there are barriers to registering in DC. And so we have to look at that too, because that's also a potential revenue stream in the city that we're missing out on. So how do we make sure that everyone who's living here is able to be part of that system? And then, additionally, I think, like I said before, maybe the nexus of where reckless behavior begins is not those 2 unpaid tickets. And maybe the doubling of the fine after 30 days is not the strategy we need. But I do think there is the idea of having a ticket to enforce a speed limit is needed. Maybe it's not those 11 miles over, maybe it's a little bit more. Maybe the trigger for booting doesn't happen until a longer period of time and after several warnings. I think we need to just follow the data and be creative there. But at the same time, we do have to enforce those penalties when people are reckless.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, thinking out the box, it could be, pay this ticket, or to get past this ticket, you have to do this, or I think you kind of touched on that.
Community service or something as a non money way of getting out of paying back your community for having committed an infraction. I don't mind that. We
Exactly.
have a question from John. This is one that's kind of personal for me too. He says, I've only been in the 3rd district headquarters, but are all the others in the same rather sad condition? The city is an ongoing program to rebuild our libraries. Our officers and commanders definitely need better facilities. Hope when you're on the council, you make this part of the program. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about why MPD spends its money where it does, right? Like, we know that like every police agency, a huge percentage of the funding has to go to payroll. And every time there's a cut, or we ask for an increase, we get half for a specific thing, like facilities, and we get half of that. We end up, it has that has to come out of equipment and facilities and training and things that are not payroll, because it's hard. That's the last thing you want to cut, is number of officers. But actually, a lot of I think at least 3 of the stations are former schools, right? And that are sort of different stages of repair. What do you think about that, Salah?
Yeah, well, as someone who worked in 300 Indiana Avenue, which was former police headquarters, which I believe it was the mayor who said it was the worst building in the city's portfolio, and it truly was. It had not been renovated since I think the 60s and just was totally in disrepair. And we definitely need to be intentional about how we build buildings, not only because we want to transition the city to being green. And a lot of these older buildings are just resource, they just are resource guzzlers. But also, when we're talking about transforming public safety, the way we build our most noticeable public safety building, a police station or a fire station, reflects how we are actually going about the business of providing public safety. And I think when we build these new buildings, and I know there's the 7th district station is slated in the budget to be rebuilt. I think we need to go beyond just rebuilding a building that's healthy for the people that work there. We need to think about how can we build a building that reflects this new innovative way of providing public safety, and having a shared station between the fire department, the police department, and these other co-response systems, because that's what we're going to just change the culture of public safety. When you're working together with people who are firefighters and police officers and these mental health responders and these addiction responders, you're going to create a community amongst those people that know how to call upon each other. And you're also going to create now a resource center for people to come and to receive, whether it's police service or mental health service or a fire service or whatnot. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there. And yes, at the very minimum, we shouldn't have people working in unsafe conditions where the buildings are just really, in disrepair. And when we're moving them out, we need to ensure we fund them properly so that, they can be put in spaces that are healthy. But we should be intentional about it as well.
I have to defend 300 Indiana that at least they're actually renovating that now. But it's the actual headquarters where the chief and commanders go that gets renovated first, for sure, right? Well, we have a few other questions. We're coming up on an hour and a half, though. What do you think, Salah? You want to take one more?
I'll do one more, and then we'll put this recording out there for folks to join in on.
I can't remember, Stephen. Did you pick last one or did I?
It's all yours. It's all yours.
All right. So this one is a kind of more specific question about things you talked about before. Why do the police and the DC Council disregard open drug dealing, and would you do something differently about it?
So I think, it's not necessarily always just a disregard, right? Part of it is just, people will call 911. They say, well, I see a drug deal happening in the alley or whatnot. By the time the police get there, that deal has already happened and there's no way to identify someone. They're not going to have the reasonable suspicion needed to be able to stop someone, right? So there's that element of it. And then there's also the recognition, which I think is a good thing, that we can't just arrest the users of drugs. That's not helping anybody, right? But we actually haven't created these alternative responses to assist them in the best way possible. And so there's a gap there, right? At the same time, when we talk about marijuana, for example, it's in this quasi legal state where it's decriminalized but not fully legalized. When you're using it in public, it's not legal. You can't you can exchange it, but you can't exchange cash for it. So there's a lot of a kind of a gray area there. And then for that reason, then the enforcement of the laws become a little more difficult. And so I think what we really have to do is position the police department to be focused on the actual dealer rather than the user. And that gets back to focusing on longer term investigations that can focus on, where are the drugs coming in from, and how do we ensure that the distribution sources are the ones that we target through enforcement and not the actual user. And the users we should be supporting through things like Narcan, and then the follow-up addiction services, so that we can get people in a state where they're sobering up and able to hopefully return to a healthy life.
Makes sense to me. I mean, and on top of that, every time, you, as a police officer, you catch someone with a small amount of narcotics, you're spending 4 or 5 hours arresting somebody when you're listening to violent crimes happening all over in your assigned area, and you're trapped at the station processing this arrest in an incredibly slow, workflow that we've got. And at the end of the day, there's a real question to the individual officer being like, is this the best use of my time over this small baggie of, crack or something? And then when the effect on the citizens that are asking for this increased enforcement with the decreased number of officers is now they're waiting longer for someone to respond over from another part of the city to come cover me because I'm stuck here at the station while you're a burglar in your house or something. So that's a real element of it too, until we start sorting the rest of this out, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, we're about at 8:30, so I think it's a good place to end. We still didn't get through all the questions, but I think that'll just be a reality that we face. But I want to thank both of you guys for joining me. You both bring an incredible amount of experience in the public safety system to the conversation. And I look forward to continuing these conversations, as questions come in and as we meet people out in the neighborhoods. I'm sure we'll be having some follow-up Q&As in the next few weeks.
Thanks. And I hope everyone who's asking all these questions makes their voice heard when it's time to vote.
Thanks, guys.